So before we move to the roundtable and Q&A portion of the program, I've asked a colleague, Clare Lyster, to perform a very difficult task, which is to try to pull together these two sessions and create some kind of thoughts about how they meet, sort of where the kind of meeting point between these two discussions about neighborhoods and green space and waterways come together. Clare is principal of the Research-Based Design Office, CLUAA, and associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Architecture. Her work focuses on architecture and urbanism from the perspective of contemporary theories in landscape, infrastructure, and globalization. Clare's writing and design work has been published and exhibited widely, and a new book, Learning from Logistics, will be published this year. Thank you, Clare.
Thank you, Alison. You know, I've learned more from this morning's discussion that I'm going to contribute. So, congratulations to you and Ken. The vibe is great. Great conference. And I'm starting not only to compliment you, but what I heard was that the conference was extremely optimistic. And that would be how I would start the conversation on today's presentations. I wanted to start out with a quote that Rem Koolhaas said in an essay from 1997. He said, "How to explain the paradox that urbanism as a profession has disappeared at the moment when urbanization is everywhere." And he goes on later in the text to say, urbanism is dead. Well, urbanism is not dead in Chicago, and I think it's really inspiring to see the work that's taking place. So I just wanted to kind of preface my short notes on that. A couple of things I'm just going to very quickly summarize so that we can move into the Q&A. Given that the context for the discussion is in an architectural historian conference, and I know that you are adopting that broadly speaking, is that it was interesting that all the reviewers kind of preceded their projects or their contributions with a kind of historical, like presenting their work within the kind of historical trajectory of Chicago's rich and urban history. And so what I found really interesting was that you know, urban, architectural and urban history is still a hugely critical part of our design work and a hugely important part of how we think about the future of the city. And so I find that's very optimistic too for kind of the role of architectural history. I was on a panel a couple of days ago here that was trying to kind of understand the changing role of architectural history in practice and in pedagogy. And I think that, you know, if some of the people that were at that panel, maybe by looking at today's work, will be encouraged at the kind of increasing relationship between history, and again I mean that broadly speaking, in the role of the design of the city. Just very quickly, a couple of things that came up across the presentations that might fuel some conversation when we sit up on the stage, or might fuel some questions from the floor. One is the sort of this issue of partnerships in design, not necessarily very different partnerships. First of all, partnerships at the political level. I don't think any of the work that we've seen here today would have been possible 15 or 20 years ago. Again, you know, there are probably some of you that can talk more specifically about this, but it strikes me that, you know, the kind of powers that be in the city are rethinking how they negotiate urban projects. I think it used to be that every little, you know, city department would kind of do its own thing and not know what the department in the office next door was doing until 5 years later when they had to retroactively undo what the next door people were doing. Now it seems to me that there's a kind of an overlap, or at least a dialogue across departments, across different institutions at the city that are thinking about bigger issues other than their own little, you know, what's happening in their own little zone. And that's very encouraging. It would be interesting though, maybe, you know, from Jeannie and from Carol, who I think are much more rooted in understanding those processes, is that actually working? How could that be improved? Is there anything impeding those kind of overlaps? And, you know, are the kind of higher ups in the city in terms of planning really getting the necessity to work across each other for the benefit of much larger goals? The second thing in the kind of partnerships category seems to me within the design discipline, you know, you just look at the diversity of the panel. And when I mean design, you know, I see Elena's work as a design project. So I don't mean design with a capital D in the kind of traditional sense. It just reminds me how far we've come, that there's no single discipline that is now responsible with designing the city. It is a melange of non-for-profits, private philanthropy, landscape architects, engineers, geologists, hydrologists, the list goes on. And that's very, I suppose, all-inclusive in one way and great. On the other hand, that does bring up some disciplinary questions, and I think that Charles alluded to that at the beginning of the morning when he wasn't kind of sure how to credit some of the projects. And so that's, you know, what's the relationship between kind of multi-team groups and, you know, the legibility of a design proposal that has to remain and is the product of all of these kind of interdisciplinary discussions. And so it's interesting too that I think it was Carol showed some images from the Burnham Plan, and that's the kind of antithesis of how we're kind of working now. The Burnham Plan was very much old school. It was all the men in the photograph. It was, you know, a group of powerful people in the city that said, this is how we're going to do it, and they did it, and we still talk about it in a favorable way. So you know, there's pros and cons for the processes that we're all trying to kind of understand in urbanism today. The third thing I'll talk about is funding partnerships, which is slightly different than political partnerships. I didn't know, Carol, that the Bloomingdale line was a sort of sole financed project by the city, which seems to be the anomaly. And we are seeing more privately funded projects. So the High Line was paid for, I think, by Barry Diller. Much of the work down in South Shore neighborhood that has been happening over the past few years with John and his firm was paid for by Gary Comer. So there's a lot of kind of, in the vacancy of municipal funding is being kind of taken up by very large donors. And one could question that. I'm thinking of Bob's presentation. One could, you know, question the role of the kind of donor in the larger kind of good for community planning and how that operates at one scale with the likes of Elena and her work at the kind of much more small, bottom-up kind of acupuncture type level. The other thing that I wanted to just highlight that I think came up in the discussions is the notion that, yes, many of the projects we looked for were confined to Cook County or the kind of the traditional city limits. And so I was interested in Bob's maps that then kind of explode out to show the kind of metropolitan city and the kind of almost 9 million people we have. And I think that we have to kind of maybe encourage ourselves to start thinking at that scale. Because even a small scale project in Pilsen or in Bridgeport, especially when it's related to the hydrological systems of the region, has impact over and beyond its own kind of neighborhood. So what goes into the lake at Duluth has an impact in Chicago, or what goes into the river in Bridgeport has an impact much further on. So what I might sort of also in a discussion later, the kind of regional significance of much of the work that we've seen today. And that's, I think, important to the much greater future of Chicago. I think we're going to lose our status as the third city of the country pretty soon. We will lose our status of the fourth city of North America. So Houston and Toronto are going to overtake us. I know that the statistics are kind of fuzzy on how that's all determined. But on one level, we have to be mindful of long-term future, keeping people in the city, keeping businesses in the city, keeping a tax base in the city. And so that's why I think it's great when especially Martin's research, that goes beyond design as a kind of object in the landscape to really thinking about design as an economic engine for the city. Because unless we continue to grow as an urban entity, these projects will become harder and harder to implement. So I see much of this work being for the tourist who comes, but also about the people who live here and getting more people to live here. The last thing I'll just draw attention to, which goes back to the kind of design comment and this notion of design opportunism, is I think what the projects and the discussions, both at the community level and the larger water level, regional level, is a kind of renewed value on the one hand for architectural and landscape research and historical research. So, you know, there's a bit of a crisis in planning at the moment. In fact, a lot of cities don't know what to do. You know, they are faced with deindustrialization, they're faced with maybe shrinking populations, they're faced with huge polarizations between wealthy and poor classes in the city, and they really don't know what to do. And so there seems to be a renewed agency for the design community to kind of fill the gap that has, I believe, emerged in planning. And so, and there's evidence of that today. So you'll see, you know, Jeannie's work at the GSD is prefaced by planning research, or I don't know how you would call that in the book. Many of us are involved in not only our own projects, but take that into the academic environment and are understanding how research of systems, landscapes, ecologies, social, political environments can be leveraged to generate new design possibilities. And I see that's something new, because previously, if you were a designer, you got a brief from somebody up there and said, okay, go forth and build. And you were told what to do. Now there's nobody knows what to do. So that's a huge opportunity for us to begin to communicate ideas about the city that might not result in design projects as an object in the city per se, but goes to communicate the value and the importance of thinking about urbanism in a much larger audience. And so I think, you know, I'll end on that note. Long may that conversation and that work persist, because it's valuable, it's needed, and I think the people in Chicago are doing a really good job at it, and I think so. We're kind of leading in urban design again, like we did when the drainage canal was built, and when all the infrastructural mechanisms that made the city a great place were implemented. There seems to be a renewed or reclaimed interest and enthusiasm for thinking big in both a visionary but also in a very pragmatic way, which is what everyone says we do very well. So that's it. Shall we move and sit down?
Thank you so much.